Well, welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchen, and I'm the Director of IELTS. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to Law and Humanities in a Pandemic. This series of monthly remote workshops seeks to make sense of the wide-ranging relationship between law and the pandemic through the insights of the humanities, broadly understood as the set of cultural influences which are shaping the use of law and the responses to it. As part of the School of Advanced Study in the University of London, the Institute is committed to a spirit of interdisciplinary inquiry focused on the humanities as a means of better understanding the world we face. Today's workshop is entitled The Local Meets the Global, National Responses to the Pandemic, and features 3 papers. Our format is as follows. The authors will have up to 20 minutes to present their papers, and the questions can then be raised by our audience members. We would invite our audience members to write their questions using the chat function at any time during the presentations. Following each presentation, I will attempt to moderate the questions to that presenter and also to raise your general questions and comments at the end of the session. The workshop is scheduled for 90 minutes. Our first paper today is by Peter Edge. Peter completed his PhD on Manx Public Law at Wolfson College, Cambridge in 1994 and began his academic career at Lancashire Law School, developing a further specialism in the interaction of law and religion. He is a professor of law at Oxford Brookes University. Peter's recent publications include Lisvane's Legacy, Constitutional Reform in the Isle of Man, published in Legal Studies, and the Constitutional Implications of the Survival of the Diocese of Sodor and Man in the Ecclesiastical Law Journal. Peter's paper today is entitled Nationalizing a National Emergency, the Manx Response to the Pandemic. Welcome, Peter, and over to you.
Thank you very much for organising such a fascinating panel. I will try to be fairly quick and not cover too much ground in doing so. So, can everybody see my slides and hear me okay? Brilliant. Okay, so my focus is on the response to the 2020 in particular, to the global pandemic by the Isle of Man in particular. So the Isle of Man is here. So as you'll see, it's situated somewhat between the other kingdoms of the Atlantic archipelago, and it is a largely self-governing, so autonomous crown dependency. Today I'm going to very quickly touch on that legal and constitutional structure, explain a bit about the emergency powers regulations which were used during the 2020 version of the pandemic, talk about the end of the emergency in 2020, and then what has happened since, and then reflect back on that about some of the lessons about understanding the Manx response as a response of a small island dependency, as opposed to simply a generic polity. So to start off with the legal and constitutional structure, the Isle of Man is a largely autonomous crown dependency. If you're looking at this from a British perspective, the degree of autonomy is vastly greater than that of, say, Scotland or Northern Ireland. So historically, the Isle of Man, for instance, has decided which offences were capital offences and which weren't. It's decided its own tax structure, etc., etc. So very autonomous. The dominant institution is the tricameral Tynwald, which has a democratically elected House of Keys, an appointed upper chamber, the Legislative Council, but fairly uniquely, I think, the two chambers sit together as a third body, Tynwald Court. And in particular, as will become relevant a little later, it is that Tynwald which authorises or otherwise emergency powers regulations. Relatively late development in the Isle of Man is a cabinet government responsible to Tynwald. We can only really see cabinet government post-1986. We can only really see responsible government in the sense of a government responsible to the national legislature well after 1945. So quite a late set of developments there. So 2020 isn't the first emergency that's had to be faced by the Isle of Man. Pre-20th century, they were generally dealt with by prerogative powers and primary legislation. So, for instance, one of the most significant risings in Ireland led to an Act of Tynwald, a piece of primary legislation, which created various security measures to prevent the same thing happening in the Isle of Man. Wars in the 20th century were dealt with as an imperial concern and by imperial laws. So although the Isle of Man is largely autonomous, these are instances when Parliament itself laid down the legal structures which would deal with the emergency. The World War II legislation, rather bizarrely, lingered well into the 1970s. So we see this emergency legislation from the imperial power being debated well into the 70s. The 1918 pandemic, on the other hand, and later recurrences throughout the 20s and early 30s, were dealt with as a local health emergency. They were dealt with under powers under the Local Government Consolidation Act, and there were regulations mainly involving what we'd now call social distancing, 23 times up until 1973. That legislation was replaced by the Public Health Act 1990, which was refreshed at the start of the 21st century. But perhaps curiously, the Public Health Act was not the primary tool used to deal with the 2020 pandemic. Instead, the EPA, the Emergency Powers Act 1936, was used. The EPA 1936 is based on the UK EPA 1920. There were various attempts to copy it, to take that model and introduce the Isle of Man during the 1920s. These failed repeatedly. Part of it was because the EPA was seen as a piece of class legislation, something aimed against the working class and in particular against the labour movement in the Isle of Man. There was also another constitutional concern, was that it put more power in the hands of the governor, who at this time was a colossus in terms of the Manx constitution, who was typically a retired serviceman who was appointed by and responsible to the UK Crown, in no way any democratic accountability. And it was seen that the EPA would give more power to this individual over the elected MHKs, the equivalent of the MPs. In 1935, there was a very substantial strike by the TGWU, which was very successful, and it led to quick adoption of the 1936 Act. So you have an act which is predominantly intended to deal with labour disputes and industrial unrest. In 1964, copying developments in England, it was extended to non-human emergencies. Without this extension, it would not have been available for use in this pandemic. But the centre of gravity remained industrial unrest. I've only found evidence that it was considered to be used 4 times. All of those involved strikes and industrial disputes. It was never used. It was not used between 1936 and 2020. In 2020, however, a state of emergency was declared on the 16th of March, which was renewed monthly until the 26th of June 2020. So there's a chunk of time when the Isle of Man is in this constitutional rupture, which is a state of emergency. The principal feature of a state of emergency is it allows the creation of emergency powers regulations, EPRs. These were made by the executive, in this case the Council of Ministers, the equivalent of cabinet, with immediate effect. They did not need to be discussed or approved by Tynwald. However, after 7 days, they needed to be discussed and approved by Tynwald. So there was a sort of a executive legislate, and then the legislature is required to endorse that legislation. There were a total of 86 EPRs passed during the emergency. I could go on forever about them, but to try and be brief, there were really 3 fundamental pillars to the Manx response: border control, including travel from the UK; internal movement, including isolation for travellers, but also at the peak for the general public; closure of businesses and premises, including schools. In fairly sharp contrast to the approach elsewhere at the Atlantic archipelago, these were backed up with prison sentences. The power to create up to 3-month prison sentences under the EPA was copied into pretty much every EPR. So you find substantial prison sentences being delivered for breach of the pandemic rules. Between March and May, there were 26 prison sentences given out, and a later one which actually made international headlines was the guy who jet skied from Scotland to the Isle of Man to be reunited with his girlfriend. A romantic story which led to a 4-week prison sentence. And that's a picture of him rapidly breaching coronavirus regulations as he comes into the main Manx port. Now, I've been talking in the past tense, and that is because that for various reasons, the Isle of Man actually managed to eliminate coronavirus. So following the example of other island states and island democracies, we reached 0 cases in the community and then 0 cases full stop. And Tynwald became increasingly sceptical about the need for an ongoing emergency in the absence of community transmission. And it became increasingly worried that EPRs were being overused by the executive, that they were seeing they were too attractive, too easy a way to change law. Power to create, to make what was called continuation EPRs after the end of the emergency was misinterpreted, frankly, to allow EPRs to be made for 6 months after the end of the emergency. After 6 months, even that interpretation wouldn't hold water, and instead Tynwald created amendments to the Public Health Act, which does not need a state of emergency, but similarly is backed by up to 3 months in prison, £40,000 fine, fixed penalty notices. This was created to avoid the need to go back into a state of emergency if there was a second wave, and I'm afraid that there was a second wave. So there has now been a new lockdown, a second lockdown in the Isle of Man. So it's gone from being coronavirus free for about 6 months to needing to really get a grip on things. There's been 5 public health regulations so far. A lot of the detail is now covered one step down in GCs, government circulars. And so it will be interesting to compare those 2 different experiences of governance, I think. Let me conclude by moving on to what I think is the link with the broader context of the Isle of Man, and perhaps some things that might be useful to those who have no interest in the Isle of Man, as quite understandably most people don't. I've mentioned that the Isle of Man is a small island democracy. Population around about 90k, very small surface area. It's an island. First thing I want to pull out is the importance of scale, and the importance of scale in relation to capacity. Now, there was considerable concern right at the start in March that the pandemic could overwhelm fixed public service capacity with a relatively small increase. There's a news item running at the moment which suggests that in a typical winter, the single Manx hospital might have 1 or 2 beds spare, as a completely normal situation. So it wouldn't take very many cases in absolute terms to overwhelm the limited capacity of the island. The EPRs tried to minimize demand. So there was strict mandatory social distancing rules, there was strict lockdown, but also there was a speed limit. The Isle of Man does not have a national speed limit. It was pulled down from go as fast as you like outside of the towns to 50 miles per hour. And that was in order to reduce the chances of an RTA, which would involve substantial strain on the health service. There was also a move to maximise capacity. My favourite example of this is that there's a modification to the rules barring people taking offices of profit if they're in the Manx legislature, which was specifically to allow a trained and experienced intensive care nurse who was an MHK to volunteer for shifts in the hospital. So not to be paid, but the rules about officers of profit mean that even volunteering for such a role would get you ejected from the House of Keys. The EPRs themselves were, I think, challenged by capacity. We have a small drafting team, inevitably, and yet there is as much law to be generated as there is for a large democracy. I think that was exacerbated by post-creation legislative scrutiny. Because these EPRs became law immediately, rather than after scrutiny by the legislature, there's some really poor drafting, which was picked up by the legislature later on, but then needed to be fixed later. So you have a limited number of people in the drafting team, and you don't properly access the expertise and the scrutiny of the broader legislature. It was probably exacerbated by a very, very detailed drafting style indeed. Probably worse than the English approach in that regard. You have real fine levels of detail, which are changed on a recurrent process as the policy changes. So that's the importance of scale, the smallness. It's not just a small democracy, it's an island democracy. And the broader literature talks a lot about the importance of small island and small islands, states, in understanding constitutional structures. Border control was absolutely fundamental to the elimination strategy pursued from March 2020, and which is being reinvigorated in 2021 as the Isle of Man faces a second wave. And this was taken quite seriously, to the extent that residents were at times during the crisis unable to return to the Isle of Man. So it's not just a matter of dealing with visitors, but actually people who are resident in the Isle of Man were excluded, or if they left the Isle of Man for permitted purposes, for purposes that weren't permitted, they may not be unable to return. So really quite stringent. And there's been some, I think, misguided questioning about whether that's a violation of international law, but it all depends on the status of the Isle of Man international law. So being an island mattered. And I think being a dependency mattered. Now, if you go back to 1765, when the Isle of Man most obviously became a crown dependency, it was incredibly important. The Isle of Man was basically run from London. But as the Isle of Man has increased in autonomy, actually being a dependency was of very limited importance in 2020. The Crown was asked to give its formal assent to some modification of primary legislation to a change to the EPA mid-crisis, and there was some cooperation with UK armed forces, or at least anticipation of cooperation with UK armed forces. But being a dependency didn't really matter. Having been a dependency was really important, because all of the structures around accessing excess capacity and specialism has really been a hub and spoke model where it links into the UK. So specialist medical services, Manx people fly over to Liverpool for specialist medical services paid for by the Isle of Man. Long-term prisoners are routinely sent into English prisons for the bulk of their sentence. And the Manx legal profession training is very closely linked to that of the England. And this intertwining has survived increased Manx autonomy. I could give lots of examples, but basically when they were creating the EPRs, they needed to recognise that the island, although an island, was entwined with its larger neighbour. Final thoughts. Well, in a practical sense, I think there's some lessons to be learned from the future emergencies. I was hoping when I took up the opportunity to be involved in this session that I would be purely speaking in the past tense. There is now another emergency in the Isle of Man. It's being dealt with by a different structure, and yet a lot of the actual rules have benefited from the honing of the EPRs. So, the rules limiting to people staying indoors, for instance, reflect the very latest iteration of that from the 2020 emergency, not the initial one. The EPA, having been largely ignored for 70 years, is now up for reform. It's been out for consultation, and I'm hoping that will take account of the 2020 experience, which really pulled out some of the flaws. Broader constitutional implications. This, I think, is a classic example of the increase of autonomy of the Isle of Man. If you look at earlier emergencies, that they are primarily dealt with as either an imperial emergency or by imperial officers. This one was a national emergency dealt with primarily by national resources, national policymakers. And because of the importance of insularity in dealing with the pandemic, I think there's a new emphasis on Manxness and border controls. So I think the question of control of Manx borders and who has a moral claim to be allowed to pass those borders has really moved up the agenda because of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. A fascinating paper. And if anyone in the audience wasn't interested in the Isle of Man beforehand, I'm sure they are now. I certainly found it very stimulating. And if anyone wishes to raise a question or comment, please let me know through the chat function, and happy to get you involved. But to start off, Peter, it strikes me that the idea of the island identity, as you say, is very important. And that's been commented on in other national contexts around the pandemic. But what I think your paper highlights is, as you point out, that it's not just any kind of island, that there may be particular types of island identities that result in particular responses. And in this regard, perhaps the obvious comparator is New Zealand in terms of the response, rather than, say, the United Kingdom in terms of response. Does that seem right to you?
It does, and it illustrates, I think, some of the key differences about scale. I mean, people have made a lot of points about the geographical remoteness of New Zealand, which obviously does not apply to the Isle of Man. The guy jet skied from Scotland to the Isle of Man in the course of a morning, for instance. But I think the other important, it's not so much the remoteness, it's the scale for the Isle of Man. It could not have severed all the connections that it did. Let me give you a very specific example. There's been a long-standing agreement where the Manx Health Service, for specialist treatment and specialist tech, will fly patients to Liverpool to be treated in the English NHS, paid for by the Manx government. So there's an entire bunch of medical capacities which is simply not available on Ireland. And throughout the lockdown, even at its most stringent, one of the exceptions was this sort of medical transfer can happen and you can come back again afterwards. And so there was a bit of a temptation to completely pull the drawbridge up. And at times the border control was very, very tight. But actually there was more and more seepage as it was realized that there were more and more things which the Isle of Man was entwined with its largest neighbor. Arguably that went too far at points. So a group of welders who were all in prison, for instance, came over to do some work which did not appear to be particularly specialist and did not appear to be particularly urgent on the basis of being key national infrastructure. Just very quickly to follow that, also, the initial rules assumed that it was all one way, that the Isle of Man needed to buy in capacity to do things. And then it was realised that actually quite a lot of people lived in the Isle of Man who were routinely delivering key services in the UK. So, for instance, there's actually a fellow academic who sits in the Isle of Man and is part of a team working on redeploying existing therapies to deal with coronavirus based in Ulster. So restrictions on his ability to move were actually not affecting the Isle of Man particularly, but were damaging the capacity of the neighbour.
And on that point about influence, intertwining, and isolation, when you talk about the drafting of legislation, I'm wondering to what extent, was this done in sort of splendid isolation, or were drafters drawing upon legislation being drafted in other jurisdictions, the UK legislation, or indeed elsewhere?
It's interesting. I think the drafting team is extraordinarily good and dealt with a massive challenge very, very well. I think that for particular points they did draw upon other models, but there was no off-the-shelf model they could take. The Isle of Man reacted early and hard through the EPRs, which is a very distinctive Manx way of dealing with things. And one of the things that is noticeable in the debates in Tynwald, which endorse the EPRs, is there's no reference to this being, this is okay because it's been happening in England, or this is okay because Scotland has adopted it. They've been very much dealt with purely as this is a text in front of us. And part of that is because a lot of the problems that were being dealt with didn't travel particularly well. So there was a big debate, for instance, around how we dealt with planning permission, because we tended to ship the upper echelon planning appeal people over from the UK. Not a problem at all for the UK structures. So I think there is an interesting piece of work to be done on comparing different responses to the pandemic. But certainly the Manx drafting was very much treated as a Manx activity rather than, as in a lot of previous law reform, this already works, we'll take it off. Because typically the Isle of Man would wait 2 or 3 years to see if England had dropped any clangers and then consider adopting legislation. And obviously there's been no opportunity to do that, particularly because the Isle of Man's acted quicker and harder than England.
And on that point about comparison and acting hard, the prison sentences, that's interesting. I mean, how do you explain that? Is that sort of a matter of legal culture, of what's it all about?
I think there is an element of legal culture in there. It can be exaggerated because there's some areas where Manx legal culture is definitely more inclined to sentencing, typically around drug offences, which can also be seen as something, a biochemical threat coming from outside. So there's some parallels there. I think perhaps there were 2 technical problems with the EPA which led to it starting high and then staying high for consistency. The EPA allowed each regulation to create criminal offences of up to 3 months and a certain fixed upper fine. And every EPR adopted the maximum. There was no nuancing in the different criminal offences. So you had all of them having this 3-month maximum, and once a number of people had been sentenced, obviously the small judiciary is going to be looking around, going, "Oh, how does that look compared with these other ones?" A lot of the sentencing concerned people who had travelled into the more dangerous UK and then returned and then not obeyed the rules about how they should act, or had come over to the Isle of Man with special permission given to them. So there was sort of a sense that you knew what you were doing here, and this is our this is our moat, this is our protection. So I think that also inclined people to go higher. And I think the third issue is the original iteration of the EPA did not have any fixed penalty system. So there was no quick and easy nudge that you could give by giving somebody a low instant payable fine. So I think all of those things pushed us further up in the penal system than the English experience was. And then once there was once cases started to be sentenced, and early there were people getting 2-3 week prison sentences, they were then a precedent which could be drawn upon. There is also an element in which some of the heavier sentences are actually for repeat offenders. So you find some people who I think would have been quite surprised. And so if you look at some of the international news coverage, it does stress, this is a person who had no idea. They just thought they were going to tier 4 or something similar. There were some people who were very surprised by the rules and the severity and ended up in prison. For instance, a 60-year-old lady who'd gone to the Isle of Man to settle her mother's estate was, I think, very surprised to find her violation resulted in a 4-week prison sentence. But the repeat offenders, I think, were less surprised.
Right. And finally, and this is really speculation, do you think some of the changes that were brought in as a result of the emergency will revert? And what struck me is it's always said, income tax was brought in as an emergency measure in the First World War in some jurisdictions, and the emergency never ended. And I'm wondering, do you think speed limits will just end up being kept?
No, I have one worry, which was that the emergency went on probably too long. But then the EPRs gave an afterlife to the emergency. So there was dynamic management under emergency powers rather than simply the emergency is now finished. These are some leftovers we need to deal with the legacy of. So I was and am concerned that having used the EPRs, it can appear very attractive. This is a quick way of getting our legislation through. It's really efficacious. Thankfully, the 6-month cutoff, which was built into the legislation, meant that the executive had to wean themselves off that. And so that was why we have to shift to the Public Health Act, which is narrower and more constrained. It has its flaws, but it's narrower. I think there's very little substantive stuff which has lingered. The one which was most likely was the speed limit, because we're quite unusual not having a national speed limit. And particularly if you ever travel around the Manx roads, you'll see there's some bits where you think, this needs a limit of some kind. But there was quite a strong backlash against mutters that it should be introduced in primary legislation, having had the pandemic experience. And interestingly, in the new in the new public health based crisis, the powers arguably don't extend to allowing speed limits anyway. But there is not, I think, a strong appetite for it. So my concern is that the aftershocks are constitutional, rather than the substantive rules that have been adopted, because so many of them were such unusual ruptures to normal life. But I would say that's one of the advantages of a state of emergency. It is a rupture. It's a discontinuity. It says, look, the normal rules don't apply here, and hopefully you then revert back to the pre-state of emergency because it is seen as a rupture, because it's seen as a disjunction. So fingers crossed anyway.
Okay. Well, Peter, thank you very much. A fascinating paper. And now we move on to our next paper. And our next paper is co-authored by Fred Kellogg, George Brown-Rigo, and Pedro Spindola Bezarra Alves. Fred holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University, a law degree from Harvard, LLM and JSD from George Washington University, and a doctor honoris causa from Bridgewater State University. He's the author of 5 books and numerous articles on the philosophy of law. George holds a graduate degree in law and philosophy, a master's degree from Vanderbilt, his PhD from Tulane, and his fellow honoris causa from the University of London. He's a former visiting professor at the University of London, the University of Oxford, and the University of Frankfurt, and he is emeritus professor at the Federal University of Pernambuco. Pedro graduated in law from Catholic University of Pernambuco, holds a master's degree in theory and dogmatic of law from the Federal University of Pernambuco, and is a PhD student in the postgraduate program of language studies at the Catholic University of Pernambuco, and is a university professor and lawyer. Their paper is entitled Prospects for Recovery in Brazil, Dewey and Democracy, the Legacy of Fernando Cardoso, and the Obstruction of Jair Bolsonaro. It will be presented today by George and Pedro. So over to you both.
Okay. First of all, I would like to greet the organizers of this event, as well as the Institute of Advanced Studies in University of London, on the name of Professor Carl and Dewey. The scope of this presentation consists of underlining the social historical problems in Brazil with focus on its educational legal dimensions and their reflections on the pandemic situation. The presence of oscillation between democratic and authoritarian tendencies represents one of its major concerns. We still try to argue that the pragmatic methodology could provide the better way for recovery in Brazil. This presentation is divided into two moments. The first deals with the social and political aspects of more recent Brazilian history and its democratic perspectives. The second will explore some of the problematic aspects of the present moment and its possibilities of recovering through the light of pragmatic postulates. Omissions, however, understand the meaning of the successive political educational crises which have occurred in the country, as well as its economic and social nature. It is necessary to try to design a synthetic overview, starting with the military dictatorial government which strongly remained in Brazil from 1964 to 1985, year in which the National Congress, through an indirect process, gave civil power to the civilians Tancredo Neves and José Sarney, respectively, President and Vice President of the Republic of Brazil. In order to analytically describe this period, it seems convenient to split it in three different historical moments. A, the first one starting in 1964, lasts approximately 17 years. It was characterized by an absolute control of the army with no perspective of democratic openness. B, the second stage could be chronologically demarcated from 1982 to 1985, in which, although the military control still persisted, it's possible to observe an openness toward the participation of civilians in the political decision of the government, even though the more radical group in the military troops demonstrated a great resistance with the reduction of power and control over the civilian society. There is an aspect of the dictatorial period of the military in Brazil that would be pertinent to point out, mainly in comparison with other dictatorial governments which occur simultaneously in Latin America. While in Brazil, there was since the beginning a continuing attempt to return to an institutional political normality, in other Latin American countries, on the other hand, the hardness of the military regime remained from its beginning to the end, characterized by cruelty and violence, which only finished with the overthrow of the regime. This is mainly owing to the historical roots which lie under the foundations of those countries. The kind of Portuguese colonization in Brazil had different features, mainly because it allowed in a considerable measure not only that the country could preserve its continental dimension, but the amalgamation of races was responsible for a type of melting pot. This kind of racial integration represented, as Gilberto Freire, the great Brazilian sociologist, pointed out, a conceptualization of Brazil as a sui generis country, which gave place a type of a racial democracy. How even in the periods of social uncertainty, political instability, and dictatorial regimes, the country could demonstrate perseverance in relation to certain ideals of democracy. These diversified and somewhat contradictory feelings and reactions would permit a more clear understanding of the intermediate variations of Brazilian culture. They rest persisting since the Brazilian colony, crossing the First and the Second Empire, the old Republican period, the dictatorial government of Getúlio Vargas, and the government that came after the period of 1964-1989. Itamar Franco, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula, Dilma, Michel Temer, and the present mandate of Jair Bolsonaro. In relation to Fernando Henrique Cardoso, it is important to point out that as a president, he tried to put into practice his explanatory model of interpreting the Brazilian reality to promote the development of the country. The foundation of his conception are based on the theory of dependence, which he was one of its interpreters. On the point of view of a democratic process, the ideas of John Dewey found considerable impact on the history of the country. So it is important to mention the contribution of Anísio Teixeira, a former disciple of Dewey, and the other participants of the so-called New School in Brazil, which followed the steps of Dewey democracy and education, articulated this concept as fundamental to social and political experience. It is just through the light of these ideas that the presentation is oriented. John Dewey was the great theorist and craftsman of organic democracy. Philosophical legal pragmatism seeks continuity and interaction as indispensable for an interdisciplinary analysis of human experience. A democratic a democracy in more than a form of government, it is primarily, he points out, a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. As Dewey emphasized, this is equivalent to the breaking down of barriers of class, race, and national territory, which kept men from perceiving the full import and value of their activities. Since a democratic society repudiates the principle of external authority, it must find a substitute in voluntary disposition of an interest. This can be created only by education and legal ordering, rooted in a dynamic therapeutic philosophy. Dewey, in Experience and Education, tried to balance the theory of education between proposals that understand the process of learning as development from inside out and formation from the inside in, proposals that understand education as a set of obstacles that must be overcome by the natural gifts of the subject overcoming their own inclination. This dichotomy was seen in the clash between traditional and progressive education and ended up bringing serious consequences both for pedagogical growth and for the health of democracy itself. This dispute even brought pernicious influence that until today still persists for the development of democracy ideals that inspired the Brazilian Constitution of 1988. For Dewey, it is not by abandoning the old that it will be possible to solve the problems of the new in education, much less by rejecting the novelties. It will be necessary to find an ideal point in which paradigms no longer compete for space, trying to supplant one another. They must work in a complementary way, generating a balance that will enhance practical experience with education. Now I invite Professor Pedro to give continuation to the presentation.
Thank you, Professor. Greeting to you all. I will take from here. To understand the social historical dimension of Brazil is necessary in order to deal with the pandemics. To know how we got here, it is necessary to know what should we do. The question we wish to address in this paper, in this presentation, is a fundamental one. How does a society now plagued by poverty, discord, and disease move forward in the absence of a guiding theoretical vision? The claim we are advancing here is that exists an inherent connection between authoritarian thinking and the analytical model on one hand, and in the other, between democracy and pragmatic thought. About the oscillation between democracy and authoritarian attitude in Brazil, unfortunately, our present moment shows an authoritarian tendency. The following quotes can exemplify Bolsonaro's disregard for science, democracy, and respect for human dignity. The vote won't change nothing in Brazil. It will change, sadly, only when we take action to a civil war, doing a work that the military regime didn't do, killing about 30,000, starting with Fernando Henrique Cardoso. We really can't leave him out. Those quotes are from a 1999 interview, and nowadays he continues this thinking. About pandemics, he said, People are dying, so what? Brazil must stop being a country of sissies. We are focusing on the presidency's role, not only because it is for us a great symbol of democracy, but also because it has a responsibility and power to guide the political and institutional path to make the constitutional promises real. The authoritarian, grounded on the formal analytical model, excludes democracy as a genuine way of thinking. The collective, prospective, and pragmatic inquiry is denied because the only voice permitted is the voice of government. Brazil's democracy and institutions are functioning. We live in a democracy here, but the government does not engage democratically and pragmatically to prospect thinking, which seems to be the main challenge to Brazil's recovery. So, what is the way forward? The problematic administration of Bolsonaro arrived amidst the failure of explanatory models in Latin America and the absence of any clear and promising chart for the future. Reflecting the general loss of confidence in political science and theory, Bolsonaro even called for defunding education in those disciplines. His approach points toward unreflective and impulsive government, and his government response to a severe crisis has failed in the face of growing deaths from the pandemic. The global pandemic has transformed the political environment in Brazil as it has in other Latin American countries as well as in the United States. Even before it arrived, there existed an extraordinary and unwelcome absence of thoughtful, programmatic designs for a recovery of public confidence in government. We address the question of how John Dewey's pragmatist methodology relates to the crisis and to explanatory models in both education and the logic of legal reasoning. What, in the absence of consensual models, is the way forward? Practical issues now dominate the national scene. We suggest that the way forward may be guided by the Deweyan ideal of empirical democratic inquiry. Public philosophy must be reconstructed from the conceptual and analytical with an empirical, dynamic, and therapeutic methodology. While there are many dimensions of this reform, we focus on education and law. In education, we urge following the Deweyan program of continuity and integration, the overcoming of dualisms and of rigid static analytical models. In law, we urge a focus not on the conceptual nature of law, but of its operation in resolving conflict. Conflicts are endemic in society. Some level of disagreement is normal and reflects how knowledge grows. But conflicts are either resolved through convergence of opposing practices and precedents or lead to non-legal resolution, including violence. Our view emphasizes law's social and historical grounding, conceiving conflict resolution as an adaptive process of knowledge, development, and social order. The traditional attitude still taught in the law schools reflects a deductive conception of law, a static and analytical conception whereby judges must always find a syllogism that decides the case. Such a vision is still endemic in contemporary legal philosophy, characterized by the label legal positivism, and embedded even in attempts to correct positivist flaws through judicial recourse to moral principles. Our pragmatist alternative privileges instead flexibility and the dynamic of social inquiry. Rather than defunding philosophical education in Brazil, as has been suggested by President Bolsonaro, the philosophy of law must be reformed to become less analytical and more therapeutic. Applied to law, pragmatism seeks understanding not of the conceptual nature of law, but of the operations that determine its success or failure in resolving conflict. What is needed now is a path forward beyond unitary modeling, a problem-solving path addressing the many individual needs of society, engaging insights from across the educational spectrum, science, law, communication, engineering, and reconstructed philosophy. The history of pragmatism illustrates key characteristics of therapeutically deconstructing the barrier that has been serving to create frontiers that separate and dualize knowledge, whether it be scientific or social and humanistic. Based on these considerations, we hope to establish the assumptions that will support the objectives that guide this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating paper about a fascinating national response to the pandemic put in a broader context. Once again, questions are invited from the audience. Please do use the chat function if you wish to participate. I would like to start though by going back to the point about Brazil being sui generis and how that sits with the way in which the authoritarian turn seems, at least for those of us in other countries, to replicate what has happened in other places like the United States, like Hungary. Brazil is often just rolled into this authoritarian trilogy or more of strongman leaders. Is Brazil different in the way in which authoritarianism is playing out in the pandemic?
Well, I think the difference consists on the problem of how people, the Brazilian people, react against both dictatorial system and more open systems like democracy and so on. I have demonstrated in my paper that we have, for instance, difference between Brazil and other countries of Latin America. Because in Latin America, the countries of the Spanish tradition, they were created as states. And so it has a very strong will of the independence. And this creates wars, not with Spanish, but among themselves, right? So I think that the particular feature of Brazil is just what Gilberto Freire was one of the greatest anthropologists in Brazil. He was a student in Columbia University under the supervision of Franz Boas, the great anthropologist. And also he was a follower of John Dewey. In a way, Gilberto helped me very strongly in my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, because he has very fresh experience that he transmitted to me from this experience that he had in Columbia University. So this, I think, it's the major difference. Pedro would like to.
Yeah, I think that too.
I think it's this.
Our multicultural background,
yeah.
I think that is a good thing against authoritarian thinking.
Now, we also hear, certainly in the UK, we hear about tensions and conflicts within the state in Brazil between politicians, resistance to Bolsonaro, at his response to resistance from your health minister at various points. I don't know how many health ministers you've had. You seem to go through them. He seems to go through them. Is this the tension between authoritarianism and pragmatism being played out within the state itself?
Well, listen, I have to talk a little bit about the influence of pragmatism in Brazil. It was short, but it's strong. When you have the end of the dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas, it's a military that governed Brazil. We have a movement, a democratic movement that results in the Constitution of 1946, and a very strong group of intellectuals. Anísio Teixeira was one of the most important. Also, Anísio was a student of Dewey in Colombia. And this movement was congregated in terms of transforming education in an instrument, an weapon to democratize the country. And this movement was called New School. And it was a polemical war in the Congress, in the new Congress, between the new school and the traditional one. The traditional one was tied with the Catholic people that tried to preserve the old ways of teaching, of memorizing, of obeying orders, and so on. And the new school is free. It's open to transformation, right? And I think this is one of the reasons. Now, you mentioned how recently we have problems with the government in Brazil, and you have very strong problems because we have a dictator as a president. He could go so far because the opposition is very strong, but he's trying, many times he's trying to take the power in his hand and make a new type of dictatorship. Because he was a military, he was elected because we had problems, very strong problems with the former governor, Lula, and the party of labor, that you have a lot of corruption and so on, so that the government finished, and eventually the substitute of Lula, that was Dilma, was impeached, right? And I think the people, Brazilian people, is very emotional. They have difficult to concentrate and think a little bit intelligently. What Dewey recommends, it's necessary to be intelligent, and to be intelligent means that you cannot accept the things as they are put on the table. You have to reflect, you have to think, you have to see what is the alternative that you have. So the people was upset with the government of the PT. And the first flag that appeared was Bolsonaro. It's like a vacuum, and somebody appears as a man that is compromised to finish with corruption, to change Brazil, to give another, and he was elected. But
finally, we hear within this country, within legal education here, we hear about the role of critical legal intellectuals in Brazilian law schools, critical legal theory. And I wonder if one of you could just elaborate on to what extent do critical voices, are they able to challenge that analytical tradition?
Listen, I'm going to share this question with Pedro. I'm going to just to present a little consideration. The School of Law in Brazil, and I take as a symbol of the law schools in this country, the Faculty of Law of Recife is a very old faculty, and the School of São Paulo, both have the same mentality, with some difference, because São Paulo is the beautiful and most developed state in Brazil. But they have the same mentality in terms of see law as a structure that you have just to follow. And there is no way, no chance, no space for you discussing what is the possible application. We don't have a tradition of the common law, for instance, as both in the United States and in Britain as well. Holmes, the great thinker Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said that the history of law is not thinking, but how you can interpret things in accordance with the situation that, and we have a lacks of this.
Thank you, Professor. I agree. I think the critical legal intellectuals are strong here, but I think our legal professions are very tied with legal positivism. So I think it's difficult to the academy to advance things that should be in the legal profession. I think that there is this main obstacle.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much. It's a fascinating paper, and we look forward to. I look forward to reading the full paper and to hearing about future developments. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
It's time now to move on to our final paper today, which is by Justicia Avila Veda and Gega Rianto. Justicia obtained her Bachelor of Law from the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. She is currently practicing as an attorney at law. Gega is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Anthropology, Heidelberg University. His doctoral dissertation focuses on intercultural communication and misunderstanding. Their paper is entitled Pandemic and Mandate Shifting, Central Local Government Tensions in the Making of COVID-19 Legal Frameworks in Indonesia. And welcome to you both. Over to you.
Okay, so me and Justicia will both present our paper here, and here we share our screen. Okay, now we should see that I'm presenting my PowerPoint platform. Okay, let me now full page this. Okay, so as being mentioned, the title of our paper is Pandemic and Mandate Shifting, the Central and Local Government Tensions in the Making of COVID-19 Legal Framework in Indonesia. So what we want to do here, we will both present the paper. I will present the first part and Justicia will present the second, and I will try to establish the background. And the background to our paper is that we want to examine the idea of public health law. So the public health law is an idea that's being endorsed usually by health agencies, also by scholars and centers of studies, and also politicians alike. And public health law is being considered as the obligation of the state to assure the health of population by constraining autonomy, privacy, liberty, and proprietary interests of individuals and businesses. This is the one definition that's being proposed by Gostin. But the situation is, the COVID-19 pandemic has unfolded the intricacies of establishing and deploying legal frameworks to curb with the pandemic situation. I mean, the Gostin or other scholars usually try to define public health law as something that government has the obligation to do, to conceive and formulate in order to protect the population. But the situation, and especially in Indonesia, is it does not. The public health law or the legal framework to curb with COVID-19 pandemic, rather than conceived by the government to promote the health of the population, it was rather being conceived through the tensions between the central and the local government. So let me try to establish the background first. The central government and local government have some kind of striking discrepancies in treating COVID-19 pandemic. In Indonesia, the central government was there like probably other governments in other countries. Of course, the problem with pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is it caught so many governments by surprise, and they do not have the script to manage the situation. But for some time, for weeks and months, the central government of Indonesia was irresponsive and downplaying the danger of COVID-19. While local governments in the process begin to initiate unilaterally municipal level lockdowns. Central government then came up with a regulation of large scale social restriction, which is different from lockdown and quarantine, and it allows the local government to do their local lockdowns, but according or in compliance with the guidelines that is being laid down by the central government. So let me try to expand to the situation. So the central government in Indonesia irresponsiveness and preoccupation with the economy is actually being reflected on so many countries who were at the first place underestimating COVID-19. I mean, we could try to get example from South Korea. The South Korean government refused to close the South Korea and China border at the first weeks and first months of the infection of 100 of its population. And Germany Minister of Health refused EU's suggestion to close the entry from the China to EU. So Indonesia is somehow reflective or illustrative of these countries. Indonesia did not state in the beginning any official plan to contain the virus, and instead they're focused on ameliorating the economic impact of the pandemic by, for example, promoting tourism. This is one of the policies that's being conceived in amid of the pandemic, while other countries starting to lockdowns and try to restrict movement everywhere. The president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, just simply said that we need to boost our economy by promoting tourism, and that was on February 29, and several countries has started to consider a lockdown, a national lockdown. So this has the background, this ambition and this hard-headedness of the government had the background. Probably we could try to look at the 2019 election. Since the 2019 election of the incumbent president, Joko Widodo, his main mission is to grow the economy by encouraging investment. He sensed that for a few years ahead, there's a threat of recession in Indonesia, especially since the the scale of the in foreign investment that's being outpoured to Indonesia is being decreased by year to year during his first administration. And this actually, I think this is this having the effect of pushing the government to try to conceal and being so discreet about the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia. And in fact, the government tried to conceal the first two cases found in Indonesia due to concern that the fear of COVID-19 is more damaging than the virus itself. And eventually, President enacted the National COVID-19 Economic Recovery Committee. But in trying to ameliorate the situation with the pandemic COVID-19, they're trying to do more by they're trying to lean more to the economic approach, which is actually trying to ameliorate the effect of the pandemic to the economy by pushing the spending of the government and giving stimulus to the population. And other than that, I don't think the concern of trying to limit the people movement and social activities is being the main concern of the government, because during the first few months into the pandemic in Indonesia, we rather after the first lockdown and the second lockdown and so on, usually the government also trying to they're not trying to downplay the COVID-19 pandemic after some backlash in the first few months, but they're looking so hesitated to restrict movement of people from place to place. And I think they're secretly trying to promote tourism at the few months after the pandemic, because they're trying to get the economy going again. And then, so we have a situation. We have this background situation of the relationship between the central and local government in Indonesia is actually precarious. The central government panicked at first, and they're trying to impose the framework for a lockdown. Not impose, they're trying to offer the legal framework for a lockdown. Not when the civil societies are criticizing and scrutinizing them, but actually when the local government began blocking access in and out of their cities or province, because the central government was irresponsive toward the pandemic. And rather than one of our argument here is this is something that make the government consider seriously to formulate their own legal framework to curb pandemic COVID-19, and especially to impose a lockdown, which is called the PSBB, the large-scale social restriction. This is different than typical lockdown in other countries. It only restricts business activities, school activities, and work hours. And contrary to its name, the large-scale social restrictions is not conducted by the central government, but by the local government with the approval of the National Ministry of Health. And the president was not in favor of restricting movements and social activities. Months after the central government introduced this policy, the president actually said that he was glad he was not opting toward the national lockdown, because he saw that the economic impact of the national lockdown was so severe in other countries. He was grateful because of that. So we try to establish here the situation, the difference between the local and the central government, and the central government is leaning toward the economy, while the local government trying their hardest to attend to their population health, and then they're trying unilaterally to impose their own lockdown, and this caused a problem for the central government, and there by making like the legal framework of the large-scale social restriction, they actually trying to push it back to the local government. So this is the guidelines that we have for you, and you can try to impose it, but you need to stay to our guidelines. And also, if at that point the central government did not try to offer the legal framework, I think we think that the local government will show a massive disobedience among them, and there will be the coordination between the central and local government in Indonesia, which has been for decades has been precarious, will be I think will be a mess at that point. So the next part will be Justitia's part. So I will hand the opportunity to you.
Yep, thank you so much, Geger. Thank you everyone for the opportunity. As mentioned by Geger, there has been a pull and push relationship between the local governments and the central governments. So historically, basically they are trying to retain one of they want to basically retain one of another's authority in so many areas. But with the law number 23 of 2014 regarding the local governments, there has been a separation of authorities between both governments. As we can see, health matters falls under the authority of the local government. But when it comes to the public health emergency, Geger, can you please next the presentation? Yeah. But when we talk about the public health emergency, we will be talking about the health quarantine law, which I will elaborate later. But at first, since the pandemic 2019, since the COVID-19, as mentioned before by Geger, that the large-scale restriction has been implemented, the president declared that COVID-19 is a public health emergency only by 31st of March 2020. And all the lockdowns, the local lockdowns mentioned before by Geger, has taken place since around February or January. The president and then the president declared that COVID-19 is a non-natural disaster, and the non-natural disaster has caused basically national disaster status within the country, and it's declared on April 30th, 2020. And then through this decision, the local governments are obliged to comply with the COVID-19 task force. This is one of the embodiment of the panic that has been felt by the central government when the local governments have started implementing local lockdowns. Next, please. So in health quarantine law, which is only enacted in 2018, we haven't had that beforehand. Every time, if there's any public health emergency, the government would always refer to the national disaster law. So we only have the health quarantine law like 2 years ago. So the health quarantine law defined public health emergency as extraordinary public health event signaled with the spread of infectious disease or other various reasons which result in health danger and potentially spreading across the countries, which is exactly what COVID-19 has done. And it fits perfectly with the definition of public health emergency. And the health quarantine is under the mandate of the central government. It has been made very clear in the Article 10 until 11 of the law. Next, please. So if we are talking about the type of quarantines, we have basically quarantine, isolation, vaccination, referral, decontamination of people who are infected. And then the second of all, we have the large scale restriction, which is the type of quarantine that is being implemented in Indonesia as of now. And then we also have disinfection, decontamination of goods and transporting equipments. And then the last, securing and controlling health media. Next, please. So I want to establish that there's a huge difference between quarantine and large-scale restriction. When we talk about quarantine, we are basically containing people into certain areas, and then the central government has to take care of people's needs, and public officials are obliged to lay out all the plans regarding the quarantine, all the programs that the government will be doing. But in regards to large-scale restriction, basically, they are only restricting activities such as activities in school and offices, and then religious activities. And I think the worst is the activities in public area, which is not firmly restricted. None of the people who violate the health protocol is being sanctioned. Again, like transportation means are still operating. There are still flights. Everywhere in the railway station or airport, it's usually crowded, and there's no obligation for the central government to take care of people's needs, nor the obligation for the public official to basically lay out the plan regarding the large-scale restriction. Next, please. Next, please. So, as I mentioned before, what happened during the large-scale restriction? People are still commuting and go to work, and there's no sanction to the employers if they insist on implementing work from office. For example, there are so many law firms who are still overworking their lawyers, and there's no warning or sanctions from the Office of the Labor. And then tourism sites are widely open. The central government even encouraged foreign and local tourists to come to Indonesia. While there was a very huge national religious day in Indonesia for the Muslim people, the Ministry of Transportation enacted a regulation to regulate people commuting from the origin of their hometown to the place they usually work, because people transmigrate a lot in Indonesia. So this kind of moving back and forth is called mudik. So the Ministry of Transportation enacted a regulation to regulate mudik, basically prohibiting people to leave their current cities. But the president made a statement that mudik is indeed prohibited, but returning back home is not. And it was super confusing for everyone, because again, people in one hand in Indonesia, we are very figure-centered. So people basically love the president. And when the president basically grants people's wishes to come back home, they keep doing it. They do migrate. They went back home for the religious day. So again, no sanction for people who violate health protocol. This is what happened with the central government. But the local governments, they often implement social sanctions. For example, in East Java, in one of the city in Indonesia, people who don't wear masks, they are being put in a house, which is widely known as haunted house. This is because the folklore, the myth in Indonesia is very strong. People do believe in ghosts, and people who are being put in the house for not using masks, they stayed for probably around one day, and then they cried, and then the next day they became the campaigner to use masks. They constantly use masks. The same thing happened in Bali. if people don't use masks, Bali is basically a very touristy site, but it is a very religious island too. And people there, when they are being scrutinized by people from the religious institution in there, they were being asked to clean the street and like given a little bit of religious preaching, they become more obedient with the health protocol. Next. So from those elaboration, we can conclude that the central government's unclear policy geared the local governments to implement lockdowns or even municipal level quarantine. Why I call it quarantine? Because basically the local governments also provide, they are ready to take care of daily needs of the people. They have gathered all the stocks needed for the people's survival for the period of quarantine. And then the precarious dynamics resulted from history of local government's defiance against the central government right now resulted in disharmony in policies. As we can see that the local government kept making a new initiative, but the central government would override it by saying that it has to be under one corridor, one instruction. But then again, they never provide a clear guidance on how to do it. And then the third, local governments seem able to take a grasp of COVID-19. They are being more transparent and more firm with their policies. And then the last, central government always resort to large-scale restriction because they don't want to limit people's activities. That means less money that they will receive. So basically, they want to apply the large-scale restriction to accommodate ambition for maintaining economic growth. Hence, number of cases skyrocketing significantly by the end of 2020. Next. Yeah, that's all from both of us. I thank you for the opportunity. Now I will hand it over to Professor Carl. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A fascinating paper about a very different response from another jurisdiction. I have a couple of questions. First of all, to what extent is the federal structure, the way in which jurisdiction is divided between the levels of government explains what happens? So, for example, public health being a matter for states, but the health quarantine being a matter for central government. Has this shown the limitations of that kind of rigid demarcation, the rigid division in the way in which jurisdiction is divided in the context of an emergency? The limitations of jurisdiction.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor, for the question. So basically, up until now, there is no clear division of jurisdictions, if I can say. The law of the local governments, it has been revised from time to time, and the scope of the authority also changed gradually. So it feels like there is no a solid division between those two, between the central government and the local government. And the second of all, government of Indonesia doesn't want to be called of having the federal concept. They always say that we are a united country. We have central government and local governments. What the local governments can do is three kinds of authority. The first is decentralization. The second is deconcentration, which is more of administrative matters. And the third is really basically assisting the central government. They have that kind of stigma that wants to emphasize that there's no it's not like the US system. I think our founding fathers always make it very clear that we are not federal countries.
Okay, fascinating. But it certainly sounded like you were acting the central and the local, or
Yes.
acting like a classic federal. I have a question from Peter. He asks, is there a legitimacy issue that made it easier for local government to act firmly? Was it easier for the local to act because it was seen as more legitimate for them to crack down, to bring in harsh measures?
I would say that up until now there is no let's say a strict law that gives the legitimacy for the local government. As I've mentioned before, the division of the authority itself is very blurry. But up until now, I think what supports the legitimacy is the approval of the people in that city. Because we actually have thousands of cities. We consist of 34 provinces, and there are still additional provinces coming in. So each provinces are very unique actually, and I think it's more on the approval of the people and support of the people for the policy to be implemented.
Okay, and finally, throughout the paper, you both talk about a kind of dichotomy between economy and public health, which I think is present in discourse around the world, but is also challenged increasingly as people point out that those countries that lock down hard are able for their economies to recover the most quickly. Is that notion getting any traction, any impact within Indonesia?
I think it hasn't been challenged yet. By the local government, or anyone who has the authority to challenge the central government to impose another policy. But I think if we're trying to look probably from the critics, that's pretty notable having a negative view toward the government throughout this pandemic. They're always thinking that the government doing wrong steps in curbing with the pandemic, and that is they're not focusing toward the lockdown at the first time, and this resulted in now in 2021 we have a really high cases of COVID-19 everywhere. I mean, there's 14,000 new cases every day. And we still do not know how to curb this effectively because, there are 34 provinces and they have their different framework to curb with the pandemics, to deploy their bureaucracy to deploy for the pandemics. But I think essentially I want to say that there was nothing that could change the maneuver or the trajectory that the central government has taken in being preoccupied with the economy.
And a question from our audience, I think this is the final question. Regarding central local government interaction, was the use of disaster law a way to impose central power over local power?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. So in the COVID-19 case, the law that is being imposed is not necessarily the disaster law, because we already have the health quarantine law. It was enacted in 2018. But beforehand, they keep using the basically national disaster law, or, even if not using the law, they will just unilaterally declare that it's a national disaster, it's national something, and then the central government will use that kind of move to take over the authority of the local government. That's what happened basically. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I want to thank you both for a fascinating paper and a really interesting and quite different response from a national government, and obviously as with all of the countries we've focused on today, I want to wish your country the very best in trying to combat the virus as well. So to draw this to a close, this has been quite a remarkable set of papers from around the world simultaneously, and I'd like to thank our three speakers for joining us today and presenting these rich, deeply textured papers that really show the way in which the global and the local intersect in fascinating ways. I want to thank you, our audience, as well, for joining us and for your participation. Our next workshop in the series will be on Wednesday, the 17th of February at noon Greenwich Mean Time, and I hope you will join me then. Until next time, it's goodbye from me at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Goodbye for now.